They call him the architect of the digital age, but Ji-ho is being hunted within his own system. Someone has turned his life into a glass house, watching every move he makes with Tricia and their son. This isn't a corporate takeover, it's targeting his bloodline. To save the woman he loves and the son he'd die for, the billionaire must do the one thing he swore he'd never do: let go of the control and burn it all down himself. The prison gates opened with a heavy metallic groan. Tricia stepped out, her body stiff, her eyes scanning the environment like she didn't trust the ground beneath her feet. She looked thinner, her gaze harder. Ji-ho was there, waiting. No bodyguards, no assistants, just a man without his usual armor. When their eyes met, the air felt thick. 2 years of silence, pain, and secrets sat between them. Then, their son ran toward her. He slowed down at first, hesitating, before finally hugging her tight. That was the moment Tricia finally broke, crying silently into his shoulder. Ji-ho didn't say, "Welcome back." He didn't say he missed her. He just said, "Let's go home." It was simple and respectful, acknowledging the huge gap between them. Tricia just nodded. Back at the penthouse, everything felt exactly the same. The lights hummed to life automatically, the sensors tracked their every move. Tricia stopped at the door, her body tensing. Ji-ho saw her discomfort, but said nothing. Later that night, a red light flashed on a screen. A system alert. Ji-ho sat in the dark, fixing a minor error. He felt Tricia watching him from the hallway. "You're still monitoring the system manually?" she asked quietly. Ji-ho didn't look up from his tablet. "I don't trust automation right now." Tricia stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "You don't trust me either." Ji-ho finally stopped working. He looked at her, searching for the woman he used to love, wondering if she was still the person who betrayed him. "We'll see," he replied. He went back to his screens and she walked back into the shadows. They were under the same roof, but separated by everything that had happened. The first few weeks after Tricia's return weren't filled with explosions or tears. Instead, they settled into a quiet, careful rhythm. They shared the same space, but every movement was measured. Words were chosen like they were walking through a minefield. Dinner became a routine, just the two of them sitting across from each other. They talked about the food, the weather, and their son's school. And they never mentioned the past or the betrayal that broke them. But in the small gaps of silence, something familiar would slip through, a quick smile or a glance that lasted a second too long. It wasn't enough to fix anything, but it proved that the connection hadn't completely died. Ji-ho watched her more than he spoke. He was trying to figure out who this new version of Tricia was and if she still had a place in his world. Tricia felt his gaze, but she didn't push. She knew that trying to force things would only cause them to shatter again. One morning, the silence lasted longer than usual. Ji-ho stood looking at her with a heavy hesitation. "You don't have to stay here all day," he said, his voice controlled. "If you want, you can come back to the company, just to ease back in." The offer wasn't warm, it wasn't an apology. Oh, and it definitely wasn't a sign of trust. It was just a door being left slightly unlocked. Tricia understood the unspoken truth. "I don't trust you yet, but I'm willing to see if I can." She gave a small, calm nod. "All right." She knew this wasn't a welcome home. It was a test. Over the next few days, the new rules became clear. Tricia had no system access and no power to make decisions. She spent her time observing and listening, learning how much had changed while she was gone. Yun-seo noticed the shift immediately. It wasn't just Tricia's presence that bothered her. It was the fact that Ji-ho was allowing it. In a world built on perfect control, Tricia was the one variable they couldn't predict. And for Yun-seo, that uncertainty felt like a disaster waiting to happen. One morning, the glass walls of the executive suite felt like they were shrinking. A sharp chime echoed through the room, a red pulse on the main monitor, a minor data exposure. Ji-ho didn't even look up from his desk. "Patch it," he commanded, his voice cold and efficient. "It's likely a routing error from the server migration." "No." Yun-seo stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the cascading lines of code. Her voice wasn't emotional, but it was dangerously firm. "This isn't a glitch. The access pattern is deliberate. Someone is testing the fence, Ji-ho." Ji-ho finally leaned back, his jaw tightening. He prided himself on logic, on a system that shouldn't have cracks. He was ready to dismiss her, to lean on the algorithms he built, until a quiet voice drifted from the back of the room. She's right. Tricia was standing by the screen, her reflection ghosting over the scrolling logs. She spoke with a terrifying certainty that made the room go still. She wasn't looking at the tech, she was looking at the intent behind it. "It's not an error," she whispered. "It's a fingerprint." The air in the office grew heavy. Ji-ho's gaze shifted from his laptop to Tricia. For a second, the billionaire was caught between the cold math of his empire and the raw instinct of the woman who knew exactly how it felt to be trapped. He saw the flicker of old memories in her eyes, the same ones that used to make them an unstoppable team. But the habit of control was too strong. He couldn't let them see he was rattled. He couldn't admit that his perfect world might be bleeding. "Monitor it," Ji-ho said, his voice flat, cutting off further debate. "No escalation. I don't want to cause a panic over a few stray packets of data." Yun-seo opened her mouth to argue, but Tricia caught her eye and gave a small, almost invisible shake of her head. Ji-ho returned to his work, his fingers steady, but his mind was already racing. He had made his choice. Logic over instinct. He didn't realize that in this game, logic was exactly what the enemy was counting on. He was playing by the rules, while someone else was already rewriting them. The penthouse was silent until a mechanical whirring cut through the air. In the corner of their son's room, a robotic toy sparked to life, its plastic limbs jerking in a rhythmic artificial dance. Tricia stood and watched the toy's glass eyes glow with a restless, unnatural light. Moments later, the tablet on the kitchen island flickered, its screen flashing white. She didn't look at the device with fear, she looked at it with recognition. When Ji-ho entered the room, the air felt heavy. "This doesn't feel like a glitch," she said, her voice steady in the dark. Ji-ho shook his head, his face pale. "Impossible. This system is isolated. No one can get in from outside." Tricia turned to him, her eyes locking onto his. "Then it didn't come from the outside." She took a step closer, ignoring the screens. "Your home is synced to the company's system, isn't it?" Ji-ho froze. The logic he lived by finally shifted into a new, darker reality. "He didn't hack the house," Tricia whispered. "He came through you." A week later, the digital ghost followed them into the office. Private company data was leaking everywhere. The board members sat around the long table, their faces cold. The whispers had turned into open questions. They weren't just worried about the data, they were questioning Ji-ho's power. Every look felt like an attack on the empire he had built. Yun-seo stood by the wall, her jaw tight. She was visibly tense, watching Ji-ho's every move, waiting for him to fix the unfixable. She lived for his control, and now that control was slipping away. But Tricia remained quiet in the background. She watched the data patterns, her mind focused and cold. She didn't get emotional. While the board lost faith in the man who owned the future, she was looking for the person pulling the strings. The office was swallowed in shadow, the only light coming from the blue glow of the monitors. Ji-ho sat with his head in his hands, staring at a mountain of code that refused to make sense. Beside him, Tricia wasn't looking at the numbers. She was staring at the clock, her eyes tracing the exact seconds between each data spike. "He's not repeating his patterns," she said, her voice a low hum in the quiet room. "But the intent is consistent. He's waiting for you to look left so he can move right." Ji-ho didn't look up. "That's not enough to trace him. I need a signature. I need a hard link." "I'm not tracking the code, Ji-ho," she responded, turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp. "I'm tracking the person. I'm tracking how he thinks." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, Ji-ho saw it. She wasn't thinking like an engineer anymore. She was thinking like a predator. She was seeing the man behind the machine, the same way she used to see through Ji-ho's own defenses. 48 hours later, the war moved from the screens to the walls. The penthouse speakers activated with a sharp crackle. A voice, distorted and cold, filled the living room. "You built this world, Ji-ho. Why can't you control it?" Tricia froze, her hand hovering over the kitchen counter. Ji-ho didn't wait. He sprinted to his terminal, his fingers blurring as he pulled up the security logs. His heart sank. The cameras were on a loop. The logs had been wiped. The very system he had designed to protect his family was now blind, deaf, and working for a stranger. But the true violation came that evening. Their son walked into the room, holding his tablet. He looked at Ji-ho with wide, confused eyes. "Dad," the boy whispered, "the man in the tablet says he knows you and Mom. He told me to say hi." The air left the room. Young Ji-ho felt a cold sweat break across his skin as he took the tablet from his son's hands. The device was dead, but the message was clear. His empire was failing, his company was exposed, and now the walls of his own home had turned into a trap. He looked at Tricia, and for the first time, the billionaire didn't look like a man in control. He looked like a man who realized that to save his family, he might have to destroy everything he had ever built. The Tech Security Summit was meant to be Ji-ho's redemption. He stood on the stage as he prepared to demonstrate the new, unhackable core of his empire. Tricia stood in the wings, her arms crossed, her eyes scanning the room. She wasn't looking at the investors, she was looking for the shadow. During the demo, the screens glitched. The clean lines of code were replaced by a jagged, scrolling wall of Tricia's private life. Her prison records, her mugshot, and the details of her conviction flashed across the massive displays for the world's elite to see. The voice of the hacker filled the hall, mocking and cold. "The safest system in the world belongs to a man who couldn't even protect his own family." The crowd erupted into a roar of whispers and flashing cameras. Ji-ho didn't look at the monitors. He didn't look at the board members. He looked only at Tricia. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply turned and walked out, her back straight as the world tore her reputation apart again. In the silence of a private room, Ji-ho's hands shook with a rare, violent rage. "I'll activate the black box," he growled, his voice thick with the need to retaliate. "I'll wipe every server he's ever touched." "No," Tricia said, her voice cutting through his panic. She was broken inside, but her mind was finally clear. "That's exactly what he wants. He's not trying to break your company, Ji-ho. He's trying to make you react. He wants you to move so he can see where the true heart of your system is." She took a step toward him, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Kill the digital security, all of it. Go dark. Use physical locks, paper logs, and human eyes. Stop trusting the system." It was the first time Ji-ho had to choose between his tech and her instinct. He looked at the screens he had worshipped his entire life, then at the woman who had survived the worst of them. Then he nodded. The next day, Ji-ho stood behind the glass of the high-security ward. Yun-seo sat across from him, looking calm and detached, as if he were the one in charge of the world outside. "Did you think I didn't plan for this?" Yun-seo asked, his voice a soft, rhythmic silk. "You think I need to be outside to move my pieces? You're still reacting, Ji-ho. That's why you're losing." Ji-ho didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just sat there, listening to the man who had almost destroyed him. And as he left the prison, he knew the rules had changed. When Ji-ho walked back into the penthouse, Tricia was waiting in the center of the room. She didn't ask what Yun-seo had said. She didn't have to. She read the change in his posture, the way his jaw was set not in anger, but in focus. "He's not chasing me," Ji-ho said, his voice quiet and controlled. "I've been playing his game this entire time." He looked at her, really looking at her for the first time since her return. "He knows how I think. He's built his entire attack around my logic. So, we have to stop thinking like me." It was a total surrender of his ego. For the first time, the billionaire was letting someone else lead his mind. He was letting Tricia in. They transformed the dining area into a war room. The table was covered in tablets, laptops, and handwritten notes, mapping out every timestamp, every breach, and every rhythm of the attack. They didn't look at the code anymore. They looked at the behavior. Tricia stood right beside him, pointing out the patterns of emotional triggers, how the leaks moved from his public reputation to their personal lives, and finally to their son. "His escalation isn't just strategic," Tricia whispered, her finger tracing a spike in the data logs. "It's familiar. It feels like Yun-seo's handwriting." Ji-ho nodded, and he understood instantly. The hacker wasn't just a fan or a rival, he was Yun-seo's hands on the outside. He escalates every time you try to stabilize the situation, Tricia noted. He wants you in a state of imbalance. He wants you to panic. So we give him stillness, Ji-ho replied. It was a new way of fighting, not with more tech, but with silence. They began cross-referencing the access logs with the company's internal schedule. The results were chilling. The leaks only happened during specific night shift maintenance windows. The truth settled over them like a cold fog. He's not outside the system, Ji-ho said, his heart heavy with the realization. Tricia looked at the screen, her voice cold. He's inside your blind spot. He's in the building. The realization that the enemy was already inside didn't trigger panic, as it narrowed the field. Ji-ho and Tricia turned their focus to the one person who had the most access, Yun-ji. He had already ruled her out as the mastermind. If Yun-ji wanted to destroy him, the system would have been dead years ago. She was too good to be this messy, but it had to be someone close to her, so they decided to monitor her. The next day, Ji-ho watched the surveillance feed of the company cafeteria, his eyes cold. On the screen, Yun-ji sat with Lee-han. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped under the weight of the failing empire. Lee-han held her hand on the table, his face a mask of concern. "How bad is it?" he asked softly. "Are you close to fixing it?" "We're still assessing," Yun-ji replied, her voice flat. "How are you planning to fix it?" Lee-han pushed, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "We haven't decided yet," she said. She withheld everything. Even in her exhaustion, her loyalty to the system was absolute. Back in the war room, Ji-ho leaned away from the monitors. "She didn't give him anything," he noted. Tricia didn't look away from the screen. "She's not the leak, Ji-ho. She's the access point. He isn't using her mind, he's using her proximity." They didn't lock her out. Instead, they brought her into the inner circle to show her the truth. The confrontation in the private office was silent and brutal. They showed Yun-ji the logs, the timestamps, and the behavioral overlaps that pointed directly to Lee-han. Yun-ji stared at the data, her face turning ashen. Every conversation, every dinner, and every intimate memory with him began to reframe into a series of calculated probes. She wasn't just a girlfriend, but she was a target. "Let me fix this," Yun-ji said. Her voice wasn't shaking with heartbreak. It was steady with a new, terrifying focus. This wasn't about guilt. This was about reclaiming her control. Ji-ho studied her for a long moment, searching for a crack. Finding none, he nodded. Yun-ji met Lee-han later that night. She kept her tone natural, her movements controlled, playing the part of the tired executive as she discussed the black box. Lee-han slipped, making a small reference to reset timing and showing a strange urgency about the black box. It was a tiny mistake, but in their world, it was a death sentence. Yun-ji reported back. Tricia listened to the recording, a small, cold smile touching her lips. "He's impatient now," Tricia said, her eyes meeting Ji-ho's. "He's moving too fast because he thinks he's won. It's the best time to make our move." The stage was set for the ultimate gamble. Ji-ho stood before the flashing cameras, his face a mask of cold billionaire resolve. "Tomorrow morning," he announced, his voice echoing through the press hall, "we will initiate a full black box reset. Every server will be wiped and rebuilt from scratch." The media exploded. But behind the scenes, the announcement was nothing but a ghost, a loud public lie designed to flush the rat out of the shadows. While the world waited for a digital restart, Ji-ho, Tricia, and Yun-ji retreated to the heart of the building. They weren't building a patch, they were building a cage. The honeybox was a masterpiece of isolation, a server environment with no external wires and cloud access. It was a digital island. Ji-ho worked with a silent, focused intensity, his hands steady as he activated the hidden systems. Biometric trackers, signal jammers, and heavy lockdown protocols were woven into the very floorboards. He knew the hacker's ego wouldn't let him watch from afar. To kill the black box, the enemy would have to touch it. Ji-ho didn't just create a trap, he created a physical requirement for access. To win, Lee-han would have to step into the light, and once he did, there would be no way out. Lee-han monitored the announcement from the shadows of his workstation, his heart racing with a frantic artificial heat. He knew the rules. Never move too fast, never stay too long. But the threat of a full black box reset forced his hand. He couldn't let his masterpiece, the tool for his control, be erased. For the first time, he broke his own pattern. He rushed to the night shift server room, his footsteps echoing through the empty, cold halls of the building. He walked into the room with the calm confidence of a man who still believed he was the smartest person in the room. He sat at the terminal, beginning the breach that would stop the reset and give him full control of the black box. Then, the heavy steel doors hissed shut. The signal on his devices dropped to 0. The screens flickered once and died. Silence swallowed the room. Then, Jiho's voice drifted through the speakers, cold and final. "You broke your pattern, Lee-han." The reinforced glass of the observation deck cleared. Lee-han looked up and froze. Standing there were Jiho, Tricia, and Yun-ji. His eyes locked onto Yun-ji's, and for a moment, the mask of the genius hacker slipped. "You weren't the architect," Yun-ji said, her voice devoid of the love that once defined them. "You were just a bug in the code." Lee-han let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You built the system, Ji-hoo, but Yun-seo perfected it, and then you erased him from it. I didn't learn from Yun-seo or just work with him. I finished what he started." He pulled a worn, yellowed notebook page from his pocket, prison notes smuggled out in Yun-seo's handwriting. He didn't need to be outside. He just needed someone who understood. His voice grew wilder, his eyes gleaming with a dark hunger. "At first, I wanted his legacy, but now, I want it all. I want the power. I want the black box." With a sudden snarl, he used his laptop to trigger a mass data dump, a timed release that would destroy the company's reputation forever. It was unstoppable. Jiho didn't hesitate. He reached for the root override. To save the truth, he had to kill the machine. If he pulled the trigger, he would lose his empire's stability and his absolute control. He looked at Tricia. She didn't say a word, but her gaze was a tether, reminding him of who he was before the gold in the glass. Jiho slammed his hand down, initiating a total system shutdown. The lights died. The cooling fans groaned and stopped. The upload flatlined. Lee-han stared at the dark screens, his identity collapsing in real time. He hadn't anticipated a man like Jiho giving up his power. He snapped, "If the system dies, I'll die with it." He bypassed the safety protocols, forcing a massive server overload. Sparks began to shower from the ceiling. "You don't have to do this," Yun-ji called out, her voice momentarily soft. Lee-han hesitated, looking at her through the smoke. Then he turned back to the fire. The containment locks clicked shut. The fire suppression system roared to life, but it was too late. He was consumed by the very thing he worshipped. In the aftermath, the silence was absolute. Yun-ji stood alone, her face lit by the dim emergency lights. Slowly, she unclasped the watch Lee-han had given her. She felt its weight, the ghost of a lie she had lived. She set it down on the cold metal. The watch continued to tick in the dark. She didn't look back. She simply walked away from the sound. Jiho sat behind the glass of the high-security ward, his presence anchored by a newfound stillness. Across from him, Yun-seo looked for the flicker of panic or the heat of a victory speech, but he found only a calm, hollow silence. "I shut it down," Jiho said, his voice level and final. "The black box is gone. The centralized core has been dismantled." The realization hit Yun-seo like a physical blow. Without the black box, there was no master key to steal, no centralized throne to occupy, and no legacy for him to haunt. He had spent years shaping Jiho into a reflection of his own obsession with control, only for Jiho to shatter the mirror entirely. "You destroyed it all just to stop me?" Yun-seo whispered, his composed mask finally cracking. "I never thought you were capable of that." Jiho stood up, looking at the man who had nearly cost him his family. "No," he replied softly. "I just stopped playing. It was never worth what it cost." The words landed harder than any digital attack. Jiho walked away without looking back, leaving Yun-seo in a world that no longer had a pulse. For the first time, there was no second move, no hidden plan, and no hope. Yun-seo sat alone in the growing silence of his cell, a ghost with nothing left to haunt. The news headlines played silently across the screens of the city, flickering with words like investigation, public inquiry, and system liability. Jiho watched them for a moment, then turned his back. Resigning as CEO wasn't just an escape. It was his first real act of accountability. He was stripping away the title that had become his armor and his cage. In the wake of his departure, Yun-seo stepped into the light. She was the only one with the strength to rebuild the ruins, taking her place as the new CEO. She didn't lead with his obsession, she led with a cold, clear-eyed focus that the company had never seen. Inside the empty penthouse, the air felt thin and sterile. Tricia paused by the window, with her gaze lingering on the cold marble floors. This space had seen their greatest love and their most brutal betrayals. It was a monument to a life built on surveillance and suspicion. Ji-ho walked over, his hand finding the small of her back. "Let's go," he said gently. There were no more logs to check, no more cameras to loop. They were leaving the ghosts behind. Their new home was a house of glass and wood, filled with nothing but light and the sound of the wind. There was no smart tech, no automation, and no hidden eyes. They stood on the porch, watching their son run freely through the garden, his laughter the only data point that mattered. "Will you build again?" Tricia asked, her voice soft in the quiet. Ji-ho didn't look at the horizon. He kept his eyes on his son. "I already did," he replied. For the first time, the billionaire had everything he needed, and he didn't need a system to protect it. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees of the quiet public park, casting long, peaceful shadows over the grass. Children played nearby and joggers moved past. It had been years since the collapse of the black box. The headlines had faded, the scandal was a memory, and Yun-seo had finally finished his sentence. He was no longer a prisoner of the state, but as he sat alone on the bench in the open air, he looked like a man still trapped. When Ji-ho sat beside him, the silence between them wasn't cold. It was just heavy with distance. "I didn't know if I should come," Yun-seo said, his voice stripped of its usual silk. "You didn't need to," Ji-ho replied. The answer wasn't a rejection, but a simple truth. The game was over. Yun-seo lowered his gaze, his mind finally still, no longer trying to reorganize the world into a system he could control. "Dad, come see this," Ji-ho's son called out from the playground. Ji-ho stood up, looking down at the man who had been his greatest rival and his oldest shadow. Before walking away, he spoke one last time. "Take care of yourself, brother." Yun-seo's breath hitched. He tried to respond, but the words died in his throat. As Ji-ho walked back to Tricia and their son, Yun-seo remained on the bench. Tears finally broke, falling silently for the one thing he had truly destroyed. Not a company or a code, but a friend, a brother, the only family he had left.